It started like any other day, peaceful, calm, and uneventful. That is, until I heard loud knocking at my front door, followed by the unmistakable blare of sirens outside. I frowned, setting my coffee down and heading toward the door. As soon as I opened it, I was greeted by three men in black tactical vests, labeled a patrol in bold white letters. They were standing there like some kind of private police force, arms crossed, looking serious as if they were about to raid a drug den. Behind them, a black and white SUV with HOA patrol written on the side was parked in my driveway, lights flashing. What the hell is this? I asked, stepping outside. The guy in the middle, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline, cleared his throat and pulled out a clipboard. Sir, we received multiple complaints regarding violations on this property. We are here to conduct an inspection. I blinked. What violations? The man glanced at his clipboard. Unauthorized landscaping modifications, parking violations, and noncompliance with HOA regulations. I let out a sharp laugh. I'm not even in the HOA, I said flatly. The three men exchanged glances. The one on the right, a burly guy with sunglasses, spoke next. That's impossible. This neighborhood falls under the jurisdiction of the HOA. You are obligated to comply. I crossed my arms. No, it doesn't. This property is not part of the HOA. Never has been. The middle guy sighed dramatically, as if I were a child refusing to eat vegetables. Sir, refusing to comply could result in fines, legal action, or further escalation. I could feel my blood boiling. You mean trespassing? I asked, stepping forward. Because that's what you're doing right now. The guy paused. He clearly didn't expect me to push back. Then, as if on cue, my favorite enemy walked up, Karen, the HOA president herself. Karen was a blonde, middle-aged nightmare, dressed in a power suit and a smug expression. I see you've decided to make things difficult, she sneered. I chuckled. No, I've decided to stand my ground. She rolled her eyes and turned to the HOA patrol. This man is in direct violation of community standards. We have every right to inspect his property. I smirked. Pull. Show me the legal documents that say I'm under HOA control. Silence. The HOA patrol exchanged nervous glances. Karen's smug expression faltered. I continued. You don't have any, do you? Because this land was never part of your stupid... Wait. Karen clenched her fists. You can't just live here and ignore the rules. I raised an eyebrow. That's exactly what I can do. Because I don't live under your rules. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Now, unless you want me to call the actual police and report you for trespassing, harassment, and impersonating law enforcement, I suggest you and your fake HOA patrol get off my land. Karen's face turned red. The HOA patrol guy in the middle shifted uncomfortably. The burly one sighed. This isn't over, Karen hissed. I smiled. Oh, I know. Because next time, I'll have my lawyer waiting. And with that, they all stormed off while I stood there victorious, watching the biggest HOA failure in history. Little did I know Karen wasn't done. She was about to escalate things in the dumbest way possible. After Karen and her fake HOA patrol stormed off my property, I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Less than an hour later, I was in my backyard, enjoying the peacefulness of a Karen-free life, when I heard something that made me groan out loud. Police sirens. I turned just in time to see 2 squad cars pull up in front of my house. Oh, you've got to be kidding me, I muttered. I set down my drink, walked to the front yard, and sure enough, there she was. Karen was standing there, arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. She looked like a supervillain who had just summoned her army. One of the officers, a tall guy with a serious expression, stepped out of his patrol car and approached me. Sir, we received a report about a hostile homeowner refusing to comply with community regulations and threatening HOA officials. I stared at him. Then I slowly turned to Karen, who had the audacity to look smug. I looked back at the officer. Let me guess, she called you? The officer sighed. She did. I exhaled through my nose. All right, I said, rubbing my temple. Do you mind telling me exactly what law I broke? The officer looked down at his notepad. The complainant alleges that you're violating HOA rules by refusing an inspection. I laughed out loud. The officer raised an eyebrow. Sir, is something funny? I gestured at my property. Officer, I'm not in today. He blinked. Excuse me? I don't belong to the HOA, I repeated. Never signed up. My property was never part of it. Karen scoffed loudly. That's a technicality. The officer frowned. Ma'am, is a homeowner's property legally under HOA jurisdiction? Karen huffed. He lives here. That means he has to follow the rules. The officer turned to me. Sir, do you have proof of your property's status? I grinned. As a matter of fact, I do. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my property deed. Handing it to the officer, I pointed at the HOA exclusion clause. He read it. Then he read it again. Then he slowly looked up at Karen. Ma'am, he said, his voice carefully neutral, this property is not part of the HOA. You have no authority here. Karen's face turned red. That can't be right, she stammered. Oh, but it is, I said, grinning like a Cheshire cat. Which means you just wasted police resources on a false report. Karen went pale. The second officer, a younger guy with a notepad, stepped forward. Ma'am, did you knowingly file a false police report? Karen floundered. I thought he was required to comply. He's being difficult. The first officer sighed. Ma'am, HOA rules are not law. You can't just call the police on someone for ignoring them. Karen's face twitched. He's a nuisance to the community, she shrieked. He refuses to be a team player. I snorted. Yeah, because my house is not part of your team. The officers exchanged a glance. Ma'am, the first officer said, you've wasted police time on a civil matter. That's an abuse of emergency services. Karen blanched. What? No. This is a real problem. The younger officer flipped his notepad shut. We want to need you to come with us for questioning, he said. Karen's jaw dropped. What? You can't be serious. The first officer stepped forward. We are. And then, oh, this was beautiful. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. By now, a crowd of neighbors had gathered. Karen saw them watching her. She turned back to the officers, her voice desperate. I didn't do anything wrong. The officer didn't care. Ma'am, you filed a false police report. You've been harassing a private citizen. That's more than enough to bring you in. Karen flipped out. This is his fault, she screamed, pointing at me. I gave her a wave. Have a nice trip downtown, Karen. The officer snapped on the cuffs. Karen screeched like a banshee. The neighbors cheered. As they led her to the squad car, she tried one last time. This isn't over, she howled. I'll have the HOA fine you into the ground. I just shook my head. Good luck with that, I called. Maybe you'll get a free lawyer in jail. The squad car door slammed shut. Karen was officially out of my life. Or so I thought. Because when she came back, she doubled down. And it only made things worse. For a brief, glorious moment, I thought it was over. I thought Karen, after being hauled away in handcuffs, would finally get the message and leave me alone. But that was wishful thinking. Because Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a full-blown menace. Less than a week after her dramatic arrest, I woke up to find a formal letter taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was just another passive-aggressive note from Karen, but as soon as I peeled it off and read the letterhead, I felt my blood pressure spike. The HOA was suing me for failure to comply with community guidelines. I stood there, staring at the paper in disbelief. How? How was this even possible? I wasn't in the HOA. My property was legally exempt. Yet here it was in black and white. The HOA demanded a $10,000 fine for noncompliance, forced property inspections, mandatory approval for any renovations or modifications to my house. And the best part, they claimed that by living in the neighborhood, I had implied acceptance of their rules. I burst out laughing. These people were insane. Karen and the HOA board show up at my house like a mob. Later that afternoon, while I was still fuming over the absurd lawsuit, I heard a knock on my door. I opened it and surprise, surprise, Karen was standing there smirking. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood three other people, all wearing badges that read HOA board member. They had the nerve to look self-important, like they were delivering a royal decree. Karen crossed her arms. "You can't win, she said smugly. "You might as well just pay the fine and follow the rules." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean your rules? The ones that don't apply to me?" A man in a cheap suit stepped forward. "Sir, by living in this community, you have agreed to uphold its values." I snorted. "What values?" I asked. "Fraud and harassment." Karen's smile faltered. "You can't fight the HOA forever." I tilted my head. "You sure about that?" And then I pulled out my ace in the hole. Because while Karen had been busy scheming, I had hired a lawyer. HOA gets slapped with a counter lawsuit. 2 days later, we were standing in a courtroom. The HOA board, Karen included, was on one side looking smug. I was on the other with my lawyer, who looked ready to eat them alive. The judge came in, glanced at the documents, and immediately looked annoyed. "This lawsuit is baseless," he said, not even 5 minutes into the hearing. Karen's mouth fell open. The judge turned to me. "Sir, do you have counterclaims?" I grinned. "Oh, I do, Your Honor." And then my lawyer dropped the bombshell. The HOA had been harassing a non-member. They had tried to fine me illegally. They had filed a fraudulent lawsuit. And the best part, the HOA president, Karen herself, had a criminal record for filing false police reports. The judge's face darkened. "Is this true?" he asked, turning to the HOA's lawyer. The man cleared his throat. Well, technically. The judge wasn't having it. He slammed his gavel. "This lawsuit is dismissed. The defendant is awarded $50,000 in damages for harassment." Karen screamed. The HOA board looked horrified. And me? I just smiled. Because Karen had finally learned the hard way. You don't mess with someone who knows their rights. The final humiliation. HOA falls apart. After the lawsuit disaster, things went downhill fast for Karen and her precious HOA. Turns out, a lot of homeowners had complaints. The HOA had been fining people for nonsense, increasing fees, and bullying anyone who dared to question them. Once people saw that I had fought back and won, they started filing their own lawsuits. Within 6 months, the HOA was bankrupt. Karen? She resigned in disgrace. Rumor had it she tried to move out of the neighborhood, but no one would buy her house. Because who in their right mind wants to live near a Karen? And as for me, I got to enjoy a Karen-free life, with my property, my peace, and my victory. After the HOA collapsed and Karen lost her precious power trip, I thought I'd finally seen the last of her. But karma wasn't done with her yet. With no HO backing her up, Karen had no authority, no control, and most importantly, no one to bully. She tried to keep up the act, marching around the neighborhood as if she still ran things. But without her title and threats of fines, people just ignored her. Her house sat unsold for months, plummeting in value thanks to her reputation. No one wanted to live near the woman who had tried to illegally fine half the neighborhood and sue a non-member. But the real cherry on top, Karen got sued herself. Turns out, the former HOA treasurer had been quietly embezzling funds, and since Karen was a president, she was held accountable. She ended up owing thousands in legal fees and penalties. With no HOA money to back her up, she was forced to sell her house for far less than it was worth. When I finally saw the moving trucks pull up, I knew it was over. Karen was gone. And just like that, peace was restored. The neighborhood felt lighter. People started hosting block parties again. The ridiculous HOA restrictions vanished. And me? I spent every morning sipping coffee on my porch, enjoying the view of my property, completely free from Karen's nonsense. Because when you stand your ground, know your rights, and refuse to be bullied, sometimes karma does exactly what it's supposed to. And Karen, she learned the hard way, you don't mess with the wrong person.